I'm Joe Devine and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. Today I was joined by Alex Stewart to talk about the quarter-final fixtures in the Champions League. Ahead of them being played, we go through them game by game and we talk individually about the tactics and some slightly broader topics for each of them. And we were also joined by Simon Harrison for the three games that involve La Liga teams. So that was exciting for us. Anyway, without further ado, here's the Jazz Flute. Enjoy. Okay, we're going to kick this off with the Liverpool-Manchester City tie. There are three other games in the quarterfinals, of course, but they all involve Spanish teams, and we've been promised the attendance of our friend and La Liga expert Simon Harrison shortly, so we thought we'd wait for him to talk about the Spanish team. So let's get going with the All-England affair, the sort of the Brexit dream, yeah? Not really, but it's the All-England affair. It's Liverpool, Manchester City, and I think this is actually a particularly, not from an Anglo-centric point of view, this is a particularly interesting game tactically, isn't it, Alex? Because, of course, we've already seen matchups between Liverpool and Manchester City this season, most notably the January fixture in which Liverpool beat City 4-3 at a point where no one was beating City. No one even looked like beating City. So whilst they've had a couple of knockbacks in the league recently, Liverpool, of all the English teams, and perhaps of all of the teams in Europe so far, have the most evidence to support the fact that they definitely could win this game.
Yes, I think it's the most interesting matchup of the four ties. Partly because I think that two of those ties I think are pretty much foregone conclusions. This one is much, much more open. And I suspect that Pep will have had a kind of slightly divided attitude towards this. He probably will have thought this is the game that he most wants to avoid because Liverpool will have the confidence that comes from having beaten Manchester City. At the same time, there's probably a part of him that would like to have got this fixture out of the way before having to go on and play somebody in the semi-finals, because Liverpool potentially pose the biggest threat to City.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about why that's the case, because I actually missed this game in January but what I've read about it since and when we've spoken about it since, is it as simple as this? Is it that Liverpool pressed incredibly aggressively and had a sort of all or nothing mentality, which is reflected in the scoreline, and that forced Manchester City into making mistakes? Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, pretty much. And add to that the fact that Liverpool have got a phenomenally exciting forward line with players that are all in extremely good form at the moment. Then throw in the fact that Liverpool's one massive deficiency, which was at central defence, has been pretty much alleviated by the arrival of Virgil van Dijk, and the fact that Karius has started to look like the kind of goalkeeper that Klopp will have thought he was buying. So Liverpool are absolutely a stronger proposition than they were at the beginning of the season. And yeah, you need to unsettle City. They're not... It's very hard to say that City have any particular weaknesses, but if you can defend aggressively against them, and that could be physically aggressively. You could do a kind of Burnley job on them and kind of really clatter into stuff and mark very, very tightly. But what you actually want to do is aggressively press passing lanes, work extremely hard to stop City building from the back, and Liverpool are set up to do that. Klopp's been building them towards this style of football with these kinds of results for the duration of his time in charge of the club. And he now has, I think, a team that really does understand what they're doing in terms of pressing, and in terms of pressing more aggressively than any other side in the league.
Yeah. I think you'd say that they would be a threat to any of those teams in the quarterfinals. Not necessarily that they would definitely win, but the way that I see the Liverpool team, particularly that front three line, is that they could, in theory, beat any of those teams, and every team in the quarterfinal round, or even in the semi-finals, let's say that they make it past Manchester City, would be in some way afraid of playing them. I think a lot of that is to do with the pace of players like Sadio Mane and
Salah.
Mo Salah, for example. And also, I think something you've sort of touched upon here that we don't often talk about because it's not very easy to quantify from a tactical sense is momentum. You talk about the idea that Liverpool are going to come into this game with confidence based on the knowledge that they've beaten Manchester City in the past, right? And that they know how to do it. And you can see, pick any of the best teams in the world throughout the history of football, and you will see at times they're in a situation, in a fixture against a team which is theoretically much weaker, but at some point throughout a game gets the momentum for whatever reason. Perhaps the team who are winning by one goal, and suddenly the underdogs start to attack a little bit more, and then you get that sort of sense of fear, and things start to go out the window, and people start to make mistakes. That happens to every team, even the calmest, even the best, and that can definitely happen to Manchester City as well. I think Liverpool are probably one of the few teams left here that have a great chance at sort of realising that.
I think that's definitely the case. Looking at the fixtures, Liverpool are away at Palace in the game before the first leg, which is Liverpool at home against City. City are away at Everton, so potentially they've got a slightly tougher game there as well. And I think what City are going to want to do is I suspect away from home, City are going to try and match that intensity that Liverpool have and press them really aggressively and try and get an advantage that makes Liverpool need to come out and attack City almost more even than they usually would in the second leg. The one thing that Liverpool, that any team that presses this intensively is vulnerable to is fatigue and the lack of concentration that comes with fatigue. So
over 180 minutes,
absolutely,
it's a different thing, isn't it? To their game in January, sort of, there's a massive energy exertion put into that, and it's all over in 90 minutes, and it's almost there's almost a surprise element to it, but trying to manage that same crescendo over 180 minutes is a totally different environment.
That's right? True. Do you know what I've also just noticed from the fixtures is that both sides have got their derby matches in between the first and second legs. So City host United in between the first and second legs, and Liverpool travel to Everton in between the first and second legs.
It's almost like it's a fix, isn't it? By the TV companies,
just to create something super exciting. So yeah, I think City will really go for it in the away leg, and kind of play on the fact that potentially Liverpool will just end up too exhausted having to chase the game in the second leg. City at home can sit off slightly. We do remember, of course, from last season that City's issues against PSG when they went out were predicated on taking a slightly too passive approach to the game. So, there's a balance to be struck there. But I mean, this to me is a really intriguing one. And I don't, on paper, City are the better sides. City are the form team. City are running away with the Premier League. Blah blah blah.
Over
blah.
2 legs, maybe City have the advantage potentially.
But I would say that of all of the ties, not only is this the most exciting, but probably as a corollary to it, it's the hardest one to call. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Liverpool won over the 2 legs. And I think if Liverpool can unsettle City and particularly kind of establish that intangible dominance that comes from really attacking and imposing themselves on a game with that confidence, with that swagger of having played. And if there's a manager that can convince you to do that, it's going to be someone like Jurgen Klopp. Then you could just see them doing it. I mean, I think the odd thing to say is that against the other sides in Europe, City have got a better chance than Liverpool have. So if City do win this tie, they will probably go further. Whereas if Liverpool win it, I think they would.
Well, you say that, but then what about, Jurgen Klopp's had a lot of experience in trying to beat Bayern Munich in the past.
Well, yeah, through Mainz and then Borussia Dortmund, obviously, but he doesn't have a very good record against them. And he also doesn't have a very good record in the final stages of cup competitions. So it's really hard to know. I think that's what makes this so intriguing, is that you've got two very interesting, successful, charismatic coaches. You've got very exciting teams, neither of whom will sit back and defend and play in a kind of cagey style like maybe you'll get from some of the other fixtures. This will be two teams that are going hell for leather over 180 minutes, and that's just probably the most cliched Brexit thing I've ever said. And I'm really sorry. Go. I'm really sorry. Go. I've just ruined everything.
And thankfully, we've got our resident La Liga expert, our very own Sid Lowe. Not Sid Lowe, obviously. That would be cool, wouldn't it? It's just Simon Harrison. Hello, Simon. How you doing? All right?
Yeah, I'm good. Cheers. Not too bad.
Simon's agreed to join us to help us talk through the Spanish teams, who luckily fill 3 of the 4 games as per usual. Although maybe that's a bit of a drop on recent years. But let's start with Juventus Real Madrid, which was the feature final from last year. Of course, Juventus under Allegri have reached the runners-up position twice already, but they did lose to Real Madrid last year. Simon, is there any hope that Juve might do some damage against Real Madrid, or are we looking at the same team as last year, who's now won 11 championships?
Well, it's not quite the same. I mean, last season there was this whole mentality around Real Madrid. No matter whether it was in the league, in the Champions League, there was always that sense of they were going to score at some point, even if they were trailing 1-0, if it was still tied going into the later stages of games. There was always that feeling that something was going to happen. Ronaldo was going to pop up and score. Sergio Ramos would score from a set piece, something like that. And for much of this season, that's kind of not been the case. However, in the last month or so, we're starting to see a bit more of potentially the Real Madrid that we saw last season. I mean, Cristiano Ronaldo in 2018 has been by far and away just massive improvements from what he was doing at the tail end of last year. He looks fit, he looks sharp. You've got Gareth Bale, Karim Benzema, they're both back fit, and they're playing a little bit better. Lucas Vazquez, of course, doing extremely well. Asensio doing very well. The only real change in terms of form coming into this one is the fact that Isco hasn't really been used. He's not the key man that he was in the run-up to the Champions League last campaign. But, I mean, if you'd have asked me maybe 2 months ago, I would have said that Juventus have got a really good chance of knocking out Real Madrid. If you ask me now, I think that they've both got their own merits on their own patches. They can both put up some good resistance at home. But I mean, we did see with Juventus, they have got a few players that can maybe be got at. It depends what Allegri goes with. But Real Madrid, they're not as frightening as they were last season in the Champions League. However, when you've got someone like Cristiano Ronaldo getting back into form, you've got a lot of options. Kroos and Modric came back to fitness last week and played against Eibar. I mean, everything's kind of clicking into place at a kind of good time for Zinedine Zidane, because a month or so ago, he was really under pressure.
Well, actually, we've put out a couple of videos with yourself writing recently on both Ronaldo and Asensio, and I wanted to ask you about that, if it's likely that they'll both feature in the same team, because the Ronaldo video focused on the evolution of his play at Real Madrid and how he's become almost more of a poacher. Maybe that's not the most romantic way of putting it, but that he's sitting up top more with Benzema. He's doing less work in the creative department, but he's still an incredible striker, a predatory striker, so he's still scoring a lot of goals. Are we likely to see Asensio and Ronaldo play together?
I think something that we've seen in the last few months, we've seen it against Real Sociedad, a couple of the games at the Bernabeu, we saw it against PSG, and that was Zinedine Zidane choosing to go with Lucas Vazquez and Asensio out wide in more of a sort of 4-2-4 kind of formation. And that basically means that with Vazquez out wide, with Asensio out wide, they've got a lot of pace, they can counter, but also these players, they're not afraid to track back, they are willing to put the work in to get back and help out their fullbacks. And it essentially takes a lot of the legwork away from the front two. So when you've got Benzema and Ronaldo, you might see Benzema coming a bit deeper to associate with other players. However, with Ronaldo, he can kind of be left to his own devices and do what he does best, which is kind of sniff out the chances. I mean, we saw him, I suppose the first big game where it was kind of noticed that he was playing a much different role was against Bayern in the last Champions League, where he popped up with a few goals, and it was much more of a number 9 kind of performance than we would be used to seeing from him before his injury at Euro 2016. So, I mean, I think there's a good chance that we could see it, because in a few games where Real Madrid, they've looked good going forward, they've carried a real threat, they've scored a few goals, over the last few months, it's been this kind of 4-2-4, 4-4-2 kind of formation. And I mean, that's seen Asensio out wide on the left-hand side, Ronaldo up top with Benzema supporting him. And they've looked, that's the best that they've looked. I mean, when they've used this 4-3-3 this season, when they've kind of stuck with having Ronaldo and Bale wider and Benzema up top, it's not the same as what it once was. So maybe we could see that Zidane in the past, he's been criticised that maybe he just went with the same 11, rain or shine, irrespective of form. But now we're seeing that, when Lucas plays, when Asensio plays, there's a reaction and they're playing well, and there's no reason to not include them on big games again.
Well, just one last thing on Madrid then before we talk about Juventus. If Vasquez is playing on the right, where does that leave Gareth Bale?
I mean, personally, I would say on the bench, to be honest. I mean, Vasquez has shown that this season he's been extremely good. It's been his best output in terms of goals, in terms of assists. He's been contributing a lot. He's shown that he's got a bit of cutting edge in terms of what he can do with the ball at his feet. We obviously saw him combine with Asensio really well against PSG. And really, he's even one of these players that are kind of in the pack that are knocking on the door to have a chance of maybe going to the World Cup. That's how good that he's been this season. With Gareth Bale, I mean, you can't really build a team around someone who you can't trust him to be fit. I mean, you can't put him in the team just whenever he's coming back from injury and he's not looking too sharp. And even though recently he's popped up with a goal here and there, he's looked a bit better. He has played a little bit more, actually, as a sort of in the front too when Benzema wasn't fit. So potentially we could see Ronaldo and Bale starting up front, and obviously they've both got legs to get in behind when they want to. Bale has played more centrally for Wales, for his country. So potentially we could see Bale included in that kind of role. We have also seen Bale included deep on the right and deep on the left in different games, and it kind of seems as though Zidane's trying to find the best way to include him without it being a real shoehorn job where it's kind of to the detriment of everyone else.
Yeah. Okay, Alex, let's have a quick chat about Juventus now, because we've made a couple of videos about them over the last year or so. The most recent one sort of serialised how they were doing in Serie A this season, which is very well, we should say. And one of the interesting aspects of that video was that Allegri liked to set Juve up to defend almost quite passively and quite deep. And one of the characteristics we see from Allegri teams often is they would rather sort of prey upon opposition mistakes than, aggressively press. And so I'm wondering how that matches up against Real Madrid. I mean, Real Madrid are a team that obviously like to take risks and try to make things happen on the ball. Is that going to play into Juve's hands? How often do Real Madrid lose the ball?
Not very often at all. In fact, in the Champions League, I was having a look before this. Certainly nobody in the quarterfinal stage has, or who's reached the quarterfinal stage, has given away the ball less, either by unsuccessful touches or actively being dispossessed. So, Madrid are very competent at keeping the ball. That sort of short possession-based style that they have means that you could have a situation here where you've got one team who are kind of hogging the ball and are happy to play it around, and one team that are happy to fairly passively sit off and wait and see what happens. I'm not saying that means it's going to be a boring match, but there is certainly stylistically the potential that you've got, a side who will want to make things happen versus a side that are content to, like you say, they're not a counter-attacking side, Juventus. Particularly, it's more that what you see in Serie A at the moment is some sides that are pretty relentless in their pressing and pretty aggressive, and then other sides that have a kind of almost a confidence in their ability to do well with the ball in the smaller periods that they have it, and that they don't feel the need to get up in the opposition face and win the ball back and immediately try and then spring a counter like a Lazio would do. It's an intriguing matchup, like you say. There's been a kind of an evolution in the way Juventus have been playing. The acquisition of Matuidi has given them probably a greater degree of dynamism in the midfield area, which has allowed Allegri to play more of a 4-3-3. And it'll be interesting to see if, as Simon suggests, Real Madrid go for more of a kind of 4-2-4 formation. Will that leave Real Madrid exposed in the kind of the central midfield area, where in Matuidi and Khedira, when Khedira's fit, Juve have got two very dynamic, very imposing midfielders, and then Pjanic kind of sitting slightly behind them and pulling the strings. I think also the way that Mandzukic is used by Juve is always very, very interesting. Him up against Carvajal, and also whether it's, it could be Douglas Costa or possibly even Dybala playing in a slightly wider role, pinning back Marcelo. How much of Real Madrid's width going forward is going to be counteracted by the way that the Juve front three play. So it's a difficult one to call. I mean, I think, as Simon said, that if you'd looked at this fixture 3 months ago, you'd probably have said that Juve would have enough. I suppose my question to Simon really would be, if Juventus can negate Cristiano Ronaldo, do Real Madrid have enough else to be able to get past them? And obviously he'd be going up against probably Chiellini, who's one of the great all-time defenders. And if you can squeeze Ronaldo out of the game, do Madrid do enough to threaten otherwise?
I mean, in terms of Ronaldo, he's kind of taken more of a backseat role in terms of creatively. He's not really as involved in that sense, and for that reason alone, it's kind of Real Madrid are almost comfortable not necessarily involving him all too much until it comes to the business end of the game, until it comes down to what happens in the 18-yard box, that kind of thing. That's not to say that he isn't capable of beating players. I mean, he is, but we are seeing now that he is prepared to let other players kind of take the slack a little bit more, to trust in his teammates a little bit more. It's not all what he's doing anymore. So in that sense, I mean, he's got a unit that will work around him. If they do go with Lucas Vazquez and Asensio out wide, that's kind of showing that they're prepared to have those players take the load off Ronaldo in terms of being expected to do everything himself. And he's kind of now more in a mould where it depends on the service around him and whether he can wriggle free. Obviously, Chiellini, we saw him in very, very good form against Tottenham. Arguably, the standout figure from that whole second leg. But at the same time, I mean, Ronaldo, he just seems to pop up in these little... I don't know whether it's intuition, whether it's just habit. I don't know what it is, but I mean, you saw against PSG some very, very scrappy goals, but he was still there. I mean, he didn't do anything outstanding. He didn't need to. He was just happened to be, sometimes by fortune, sometimes by intuition, just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I mean, you can have Chiellini absolutely on his case for 90% of the game, but I mean, what happens in those other small percentages? I mean, he's bound to get one or two chances, and what we're seeing at the minute is that he's in that kind of form where he'll probably take them.
Well, and one thing I was going to say, actually, in response to how you began, Alex, was to compare what you were saying to the final last year, which sounded very similar. Juventus aren't a counter-attacking team, but they set up, rather passively in that game, and they were punished towards the end. When it came to extra time, and when they hadn't quite done enough during 90 minutes, and then they were obviously very, very tired. So I think I wouldn't be, so surprised to see that play out again. Although it would be interesting to see if Allegri maybe tweaks given experience of that happening before. But let's move on to the next game involving a Spanish team, all three but one. Sevilla have drawn Bayern Munich. Alex, you've worked on a couple of videos related to Bayern Munich very recently. I believe one of them starts by calling Bayern Munich imperious. Is that the case here?
To me, this is probably a foregone conclusion. I defer to Simon knowing far more about Sevilla than I do, but I've watched Bayern a lot in the last month or so because of the work that Tifo have been doing with the Bundesliga, and they are probably the most impressive side that I've seen play regularly, with the exception of Manchester City. They seem to have an ability to shift and react to circumstances, so there's enough. They've got enough quality to impose themselves on a game, but should things drift away from them, or should the opposition set up in a particular kind of way, there's a flexibility in the way they play that allows them to deal with that. They've got in Arturo Vidal, one of the outstanding central midfielders currently playing. They've got James Rodriguez playing in a a deeper role. And between the two of them, they're able to keep play ticking over, recycle possession. Kimmich out wide has been from fullback, but playing so high up the pitch that I think he's leading them for assists or joint for assists in the Bundesliga. And in Lewandowski and Müller, you've got two players who, as Simon was saying about Ronaldo, they will pop up, they will get chances. So,
well, I think maybe the best way to go about this then is to take it over to Simon and say, does Sevilla have any chance of beating Bayern Munich? If so, what would that look like?
I really cannot see it happening. I mean, I don't even think that Sevilla, they shouldn't be at this stage of this tournament, really. I think it's more down to the failings of Manchester United than really what Sevilla did particularly well. In that last game, I mean, I could understand Manchester United going to the Ramon Sanchez Pizjuan and it being this kind of threatening and intimidating kind of situation and playing for a draw there. I could understand that, but how they played at Old Trafford was it would suggest that they hadn't really looked into the flaws with Sevilla this season, and really there's more flaws than there are strengths. I would really say they have improved. I think they've improved really since Eduardo Berizzo was sacked. Montea's come in, but I think a lot of the positive things have kind of come from him just picking a settled 11, because that's something that Berizzo didn't do. There was too much rotation. It didn't allow for any players to build up any kind of relationships on the field, really. He didn't know his best team. Montea seems to know that. And really, they've got some interesting players going forward, and I think that'll be where they could potentially catch Bayern, off guard. They've got a bit of quality. The likes of, this season, Pablo Sarabia has been absolutely fantastic once again. Joaquin Correa, I mean, we didn't really see the best of him against Manchester United. We saw some flashes, but he didn't have any cutting edge about him, but he's a very talented player too. Franco Vasquez under Montea, he's improved quite a lot. Ever Banega and Steven Nzonzi, both extremely good in central midfield. And Sevilla, they can mount some counter-attacks. When there's the opportunity, they can pounce, they can cause problems, they do have some pace going forward. All of these things means that, they might nick a goal on the break. But I think across 180 minutes, they shouldn't really have enough in the tank, especially in defensively. Defensively, I mean, they've lacked really a first-choice right-back for most of the season. I mean, you've had Sebastian Korcia has come in, but he's been injured on and off, and he's not really imposed himself too much. Then you've got Gabriel Mercado, who has probably played a little bit better at centre-back than he has done at right-back. They brought Miguel Layún in during the January transfer window. He has had a couple of poor games and a couple of okay games, but he's not really settled down too well. And then at centre-back, Clement Longley did really, really well against Manchester United, but all season he can be rash, he can make mistakes. Alongside him, Simon Kjær, not the quickest, but an intelligent player. And they just lack a bit of pace all across their back four, and I really do worry for them. I think that especially in Germany, they could get completely blown out of the water and shown up for, they are nowhere near a completed article. They are nothing compared to any of the teams left in this competition, I wouldn't say.
Well, maybe the positive thing there is that they've saved Manchester United the embarrassment.
That's true.
of having the similar blowout in Germany. It sounds like that one's maybe a foregone conclusion, can I say that?
I mean, I would say so. I really can't see. I could see maybe Sevilla putting up a fight at home, but I can't see that outweighing what could happen at the Allianz.
Okay, well that's the two potentially boring games to start with then, isn't it?
Boring in different ways. I think I'd agree with Simon that it's a foregone conclusion. I think you want to look at how Bayern approach this game and how they play, because that could give an indication of the team. Having watched a lot of these teams on and off, Bayern to me looked the strongest side, like I say, of any of the teams left apart from Man City. And I think Bayern possibly have a greater cohesion, a more settled side even than City do, in terms of how those players play with each other. So it could be instructive purely from that perspective, not to see how Sevilla actually get on.
I mean, one thing just to quickly add about Sevilla as well, in terms of before Montea came in, they'd gone about a calendar year without losing at home. Since he's come in, they've conceded 5 against Real Betis in their local derby. They've conceded 5 against Atletico Madrid at home as well. That they've lost 2-0 against Valencia. Obviously, Manchester United managed to get away with a point and 0-0. So under Montea, I mean, it might be down to the fact that this 11 that he goes with for the big games, they're kind of a little bit tired, and over the international break, hopefully they'll be able to get themselves sorted a little bit. It won't be as intense anymore. But that they've not. It's, at home they're still going to put in a better performance than they would away. Their fans are extremely well. Their fan base is brilliant. They're going to have lots of support, but they're showing that they're a bit leaky at home now too. So something which would have been 2 months ago or so, it would have been a really strong point in their favour that they could make a nuisance of themselves at the Ramon Sanchez Pizjuan. Maybe it won't be the case necessarily in this tie either. So it could get embarrassing, I would say, to be honest. I don't think that Sevilla have got anywhere near enough quality in defence to really stand much of a chance against Bayern.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next game then. We've got Barcelona. They've drawn Roma. The first leg is at home for Barcelona. So, Simon, let's start with you. We've made a couple of videos about Barcelona. We've got one on Messi coming out this week. We've looked at Ernesto Valverde before, and we've looked at that interesting 4-4-2 that they've been playing at times as well. Presumably, you would imagine that they're going to have the quality to be able to get past Roma. Is that the way that you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even though Barcelona, there aren't a lot of games in which you would label it necessarily a sort of Barcelona masterclass or anything like that, what they can do is minimise mistakes, allow opponents to make the mistakes before they do, pounce upon those. I mean, we saw against Chelsea most recently, Barcelona, they didn't need to be particularly fantastic, but they were just what they've been all season. They were steady, they were composed, tactically they're very, very good under Valverde. We can see as things have settled down, there's a bit more fluidity at times between certain players in attack, and all in all, I mean, they're just very malleable. They've got a lot of players that can change games. Valverde has shown in terms of making changes himself, having the right judgment, knowing what kind of weaknesses to go and look at and exploit in opponents. He's shown that he can do that all season. It's not really mattered who they've played against, whether it's in the Champions League or whether it's in La Liga. Consistently, he's shown that he knows the right way to go. And I mean, with Lionel Messi in brilliant form, Luis Suarez has been brilliant in 2018 as well. You've got Ousmane Dembele having his first very good game against Chelsea. Felipe Coutinho, he's scored a couple of times recently. He's looking good. I mean, it's all very... It's been very consistent for Barcelona. They're still unbeaten in the league. They're closing in on a historic record in terms of going for so long in one season unbeaten in the Spanish top flight. And it's hard to see anybody beating them. It doesn't really matter who you'd put in front of them. They're just very, very well organised. Tactically, Valverde's got everything spot on so far, and they have Messi to add that flourish in terms of the rest of their team has been doing very well. Ter Stegen, brilliant. Samuel Umtiti's been fantastic this season as well. All the way through the spine of the team, Busquets as well. All of these players have been performing well. And then when you've got Lionel Messi to make the difference against teams that are set up and are tough to break down, it's almost like a cure-all. Messi's presence kind of, it guarantees that you're going to have a few very good chances per game minimum.
Yeah, okay. It's an interesting idea, isn't it, really, that Valverde's done so well in one sense, and you mentioned the sort of closing in on the unbeaten record thing there, and the idea that they're sort of likely to at least reach the semi-finals of the Champions League, so you can't see anyone beating them. It's an interesting idea that this Valverde team, which seems slightly more conservative, if it's fair to say, slightly more reserved than Pep Guardiola's tiki-taka, it could almost be more successful in a way, or as successful in terms of earning top honours. I suppose it's just an example of how there isn't one great, perfect style of football, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we've seen a few different things from Barcelona in recent years. I mean, under Luis Enrique, most recently, going to this whole 3-4-3, trying things like that, people were Luis Enrique was extremely good during his tenure in terms of winning trophies, but the question became that the fans didn't really kind of enjoy the way that it was being done. It's difficult because managers can be super successful, do really, really well in terms of honours, in terms of lifting trophies, and sometimes it's not enough. And I mean, with Valverde, it'll be interesting because, as you've said, I mean, he's more conservative. They don't take so many risks. Everything's just been very, very steady and measured. It's not like there's any kind of pioneering football being played, but it's just very composed and
well, you still get the magic of Messi, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he's got the freedom to act as he sees fit. And I mean, when you're unshackling the player that's in the best form in the world, and I mean, if people wonder, because obviously You hear, obviously, about Barcelona just kind of rattling through the Liga like it's nothing. They're still unbeaten. You get this idea that La Liga, as a whole entity, isn't very strong. But then when you see a game, for example, if people are tuning in against Chelsea and they've not really seen much of Barcelona for much of the season, you can just see that some of the things that he's capable of doing, it's really just frightening. And it's not sort of reserved to just that game. He's shown that he can do things in big games this season. A first half performance against Girona very recently, which obviously Girona aren't going to match up to some of the teams they're playing against in the Champions League. But it doesn't seem to matter who he plays against when he's just on his day. It doesn't necessarily matter who he's playing up against.
Okay, Alex. Well, we've heard they're a team that Simon can't see being beaten, and with probably the best player in the world. Do Roma have any chance? What's your view of that?
I think Simon's summary of Barcelona is a fair one, and again, it's hard to look beyond them winning this tie overall. Roma's issue is that they play a style which is possession-based, is quite unaggressive, even with Daniele De Rossi playing in midfield. They're not a passive side, but they're quite happy to play the ball around, not go for broke in terms of throwing players forward to create chances. I think if they're going to stand a chance against Barcelona, they actually need to turn that upside down. They are very good at set pieces in Edin Dzeko, aerially, and Kolarov's dead ball delivery. So, one way that they could look to do this is to play quite aggressively, throw people forward, try and win free kicks and exploit dead ball situations. They've got a lot of tool players, so that could work. Also, Kolarov from direct free kicks has been very good this season. It's hard to see if they play in the style that they are used to playing, that they would have enough. I mean, they look weak at fullback. Kolarov has done well going forwards, but he's not very fast anymore. Perez is prone to lapses in concentration, not the best disciplinary record either, and having fast attacking players dribbling at either of those would probably give me cause for concern if I were in charge of Roma. Their midfield is very reliant on Nangolan's energy because De Rossi's quite old now. Strootman's never been a particularly dynamic player, although he is a good passer of the ball. And Dzeko is, again, a very strong, very able forward who scored, I think, 13 goals in Serie A. He's their top scorer, both in Serie A and also in the Champions League. But, it's hard to see where goals come from otherwise. And if you can keep Dzeko quiet, this is a team whose kind of, spine or whose best players are former Premier League players, who you might consider
the ex-Man City elite.
Well, yeah, Dzeko and Kolarov, and also Fazio was at Spurs for a couple of seasons maybe. So, they're not the sort of team that you look at and perhaps Alisson in goal and Nangolan in midfield aside, you don't think there are any really world-class players here. And to me, if they want to stand a chance against Barcelona, they kind of have to, like I say, take a step away from this fairly patient style they've been playing, go much more direct, look for aerial balls, look to use Dzeko's height and ability in the air to bring in the wide players, Sharaway and Perotti, and try and get something from a set piece situation maybe. But I can't see this going any other way.
Okay, well, we've covered all the teams now then. Before I let you both go, I'm just going to quickly ask you the impossible question of who you think at this point is the most likely winner. Not of all the games, just of the competition overall. So, Alex, I know you hate these questions, so I'm going to ask Simon first and give you a little bit of time to think about it. Simon, of the 8 teams here, who do you think's most likely to win?
Well, it's a little bit of a tough one for me, given that throughout the season I don't really get to see all too much of anything but La Liga. So that's
Excuses.
A problem. However, I would probably say, in terms of when I have seen Manchester City this season, they've looked extremely good. But I think just the fact that Barcelona, I'm yet to really see them look flustered at any point this season. So it might prove to be that, in this tie potentially, I can't see it happening, but maybe in this tie that would happen. In the semi-finals, maybe that's when we'd start to see something that's a bit more high stakes, and that's where you're getting a real fair matchup. But I would have to say, from the football that I've watched this season, I would have to go with Barcelona. I think in terms of the Spanish teams, I can't see Sevilla going through this round. Real Madrid can probably go through, but they'll make hard work of Juventus, I would say. But Barcelona should cruise through, I would suggest. And apart from maybe, I've seen some of Manchester City and they've looked extremely good, and it would be great to see a Barcelona against Pep Guardiola sort of occasion. That'd be nice. But I'd say Barcelona.
Okay, Alex.
Bayern.
Okay. Your allegiance to the Bundesliga is admirable.
I'm actually, it's worse than that. I've been reading Uli Hesse's book on Bayern. I can't remember what it's called, and it's in the other room, but it's very, very good. And I've kind of developed this slightly embarrassing affection for them.
Right.
So
okay.
I think...
On the basis of an old man's book, you believe Bayern are going to win the Champions
on the basis that I've watched a lot of Bayern and
sure. I was just teasing you.
I know you were teasing me, but
it's okay, Alex.
You also know I'll rise to it, which is why you do it. No, I think it's interesting. Look, I think we're looking at probably 3 semi-finalists, all of whom will have the Pep Guardiola imprint on them, which is interesting in itself. Like I said, probably do still quite fancy Juve to go through, and then I think it does to a degree come down to, what the semi-final arrangements are. I think it's Bayern against Man City in a semi-final would be a shame, because I think that would make the most interesting final, personally, for me. But again,
tell you what, that is a better question to ask on a tactics podcast. Is what is the most interesting matchup, rather than who's going to win.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. As I said before, I think Liverpool City is the most interesting tie tactically of these, in terms of producing a match that's both tactically interesting and results in a good football match. I think the kind of the chess sort of game that you might get out of Juve and Real could be interesting, but not quite in the same way. And I think the other two ties are too straightforward for the favourite sides to produce something that's tactically that interesting. So it all comes down to the semis, doesn't it? And who gets who and who's fit at the time. And it's a really, really hard one to pick. But of all the sides I've watched regularly, Bayern are the one that have impressed me most, apart from Man City.
Okay, well, we'll come back after the semis then, and we might try and get Mr. Simon Harrison to come back as well. That'd be very useful to us. But Simon, Alex, thank you very much for joining me, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime, guys.